So today we're welcoming Dr. Thomas Hesselberg, who's going to talk to us about the fascinating world of cave spiders and their behavioral adaptations to this unique, different and strange and almost alien environment. So over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Kieran, and thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk. It's really an honor to speak to so many of you here as well. So yeah, I'm mainly going to be talking about, well, I am going to be talking about cave spiders, but I just thought I'd introduce myself just very briefly. So I'm based at the Department for Continuing Education mainly, which is the adult education arm of the University of Oxford, based, and where we basically offer a large number of courses to people. We also do run a couple of courses that are particularly relevant for you guys, perhaps. So I'm just going to very briefly just mention that we do a postgraduate certificate in ecological survey techniques, which is a sort of a whole third of a master's kind of course. But each of the modules we run can also be taken alone, and just particularly highlighted here is we do an invertebrate biodiversity and population monitoring methods course as well, if somebody's interested. But basically my research is mainly to do with behavioral ecology and behavioral adaptations in invertebrates in general, but in particular in spiders. I do work with non-cave spiders as well, but I'm particularly fascinated about cave spiders. So that's basically what I'm going to be focusing on here. I do tend to talk about quite a lot, but I will try and finish as Ian said. I have to be leaving at 2 o'clock, so I do want to make sure that there is time at the end for some questions. So let's see how I get on, but I might skip and go over some slides relatively quickly. I know the title also talks about behavioral adaptations, both in foraging in the webs and in dispersal, but I am actually probably going to mainly talk about the web adaptations and what kind of behavioral adaptations that might result in. So, but I will first start up giving a very brief characteristics of the actual cave habitats and why it's a good place to study behavioral adaptations and behaviors in general. And then I will talk about this method, the spider, the cave spider webs and its unique modifications. And then the main bulk of the talk will be basically trying to develop or trying to answer the question if these modifications we see to these webs are adaptations to the cave environment or not. And then very briefly, I'll talk about a couple of other interesting behaviors that these spiders show. Okay, so the cave environment, it's actually, I also think it's always a shame that it's not very much focus on caves, because it's actually not such a rare habitat as you might sometimes think if you're just sort of looking up in an ecology book or, you know, taking courses. The cave environment is usually not mentioned, but as you can see in the slides here to the left, basically where the purple is showing all the different karst regions of the world, karst is actually quite common, and most karst regions have caves in them. So we do basically need to promote it a little bit more. And in that, when it was nice to see that the new RES insects, so that was Zoological Society's new book Insects, I was actually being asked to write a very brief section about insects in caves. But there is a little bit more focus on caves. It's good to see, and hopefully with this talk as well, I'll inspire some of you as well to have a little look at the kind of fascinating world in there. But what is the characteristic of caves? Well, obviously, as you probably have guessed, it's the lack of light is really a main characteristics of caves. It is, though, worth mentioning that we typically sort of zonate a cave. So we have sort of 3 different zones. We have the dark zones, which is the furthest one in, which is actually completely dark, no light, constant temperatures. And then we have the entrance zone, which is basically just the opening of the cave and where direct sunlight can penetrate to some extent. But then we have this transition zone we call the twilight zone, and that's sort of a little bit of combination. So you sometimes still see insects and other organisms from outside getting into the twilight zone, and you'd have a little bit of light, although typically not enough for actually seeing anything. But the spiders I'm going to talk about are mainly found in the twilight zone. So that's the kind of zone that I'm particularly going to focus on here. But what does this lack of light means? It obviously means that there is very little plant life. I mean, there might be a little bit in the entrance zone, but in general, plants are not found in caves. So that means no primary production and also quite stable environmental conditions. So what does these conditions result in? Well, since there is no primary production, most caves are nutrients poor. And that's actually a really important aspect of the ecology and what we expect to see in caves, right? Because the organisms there have to be adapted to quite low nutrients levels. So they're not encountering food very often, and they're basically there in numbers as well. So all the food that they do find in caves come from the outside, sometimes because, as is in the picture on the right here, bats, for example, over nights, over days, so just stay in the caves during the day and then leave at night to forage. But that means that they come in, they defecate, and they leave organic matter inside the caves. Organic matter can also come via streams, so many caves do have some underground streams as well, or it can be blown into the caves. But in general, it's quite in low levels. So this lack of nutrients basically means that we have simpler food webs. So we have far fewer organisms there. The fewer species we have, they also have fewer individuals there. So in general, we have a much more simplified trophic system or food webs than we have in the outside. So I'll show a little bit one there showing that cave spiders, which we'll talk about here, are actually often the apex predators. So the main predators in caves are often spiders. I mean, they are quite large spiders, but still, it's very unusual, obviously, that a spider would be the main predator. So all these kind of combination of different environmental conditions and the sort of the uniqueness of the low nutrients, the lack of light, of course, as well, in terms of obviously vision, then is not an important sensory system, means that we do get quite a lot of very unique organisms living in cave. And because of also once you sort of got used to live in a cave, or you adapted to live in a cave, then basically it's quite difficult for you to actually leave the cave and go to another cave. So there's quite limited dispersal, at least within sort of larger cave systems. Often caves within the same mountain are actually linked in ways that we can't tell. So we go into a cave, can't get any further, go to another cave, they look completely separate, but there might be very small little fissures and cracks in the limestone where smaller organisms can actually move from caves to caves. But because of this kind of unique systems, these caves are often viewed as sort of basically field laboratories for studying ecological and evolutionary aspects, because it's quite difficult to study in a tropical rainforest, for example, because you have this very, very complicated number of variables and number of different species interacting, whereas in caves, you have a much simpler system. So what are the kind of adaptations we mainly see in cave organisms? Well, the main one, and again, perhaps not surprising, are adaptations to the lack of light. So that means we often see species without eyes, and we often see species without pigmentation. So as you can see, here's a couple of examples. The Mexican tetra cavefish is quite interesting because it comes in two different forms. One above ground one that looks like a normal fish, and then the cave morph, as you can see below there, that have no eyes and no pigments. Another interesting one I just want to very briefly pick up is the first flying troglodyte that is from a cave in Croatia. It's a midge, a non-biting midge. And basically, it's a completely blind insect that nonetheless is able to fly. That's, of course, quite unusual because in the darkness of caves, we don't normally expect flying insects at all, and certainly not some that are adapted to fly. They probably fly around with their legs outstretched and then bump into something. So it's unclear what the sort of main advantage of being able to fly is when they're so far deep into a cave. But it's slightly relevant for what I'm going to talk about, potential prey of my cave spiders. Other type of adaptations to cave includes alternative sensory structures. One is that eyes are not very useful there. Elongations of legs, for example, is one that we see quite a lot, probably again so that they can extend the reach basically, and ensuring that they can feel their way around the cave rather than using vision. There's also quite a lot of physiological adaptations. We know from caves, the most common one, of course, again, is that they have to be able to survive starvation far better than other species because of the lack of food that they find. So some species, for example, the olm, which is a cave salamander that's shown on the right, can survive more than 18 months without food. Other adaptations is a more exploratory sort of strategy for finding food. So moving more perhaps, but slower, reducing metabolic rate, broaden your diet as well, eating more opportunistic, and try to eat more than what you can or what a similar organisms outside would do. Behavioral adaptations, though, is obviously what I'm particularly interested in, and what is a key topic for this particular talk. But we don't actually know that much about behavioral adaptations in cave organisms, because most cave organisms, as I said, are quite rare. You go into a cave to try and observe these behaviors, you have a problem if you don't often find the organisms you want to study the behavior of, or if you do find it, then your presence is potentially likely to change their behavior, because it's very difficult to be completely hidden away in a cave. Your carbon dioxide, your heat and stuff like that is going to change the micro environment. Nonetheless, we did a recent sort of meta review of all the papers published, and did find some general trends for cave organisms in general. So they do show less complex anti-predator behavior. Again, that's kind of expected, because there's fewer species in caves. There's also fewer predators. There's your risk of getting eaten is far less than it would be outside. Reduce complex social structures, again, fewer individuals of your particular species, so less social structures are needed. And then, more relevant for what I'm going to talk about today, there's sort of more opportunistic foraging behaviors, and often using a variety of different prey capture techniques as well. Okay, but now let's come to the actual main topic of what I wanted to talk about. So the cave orb spiders, I'll show you in a minute what an orb spider is if you're not aware, but it's actually a little bit surprising why we would find orb spiders in a cave, because as I said, orb spiders, and I can quickly show it so we're clear what an orb web is, right? Two-dimensional orb web. So they actually function by capturing and intercepting flying prey. But it's quite surprising then that there would be some of these spiders in a cave, because there's, as I already mentioned, there's far fewer flying prey in a cave, particularly as you go a little bit further into the cave at the very entrance zone. There might still be things flying around, but as you go in, there's relatively few things. There's still some midges and gnats and other flying insects, but they're quite rare. Nonetheless, we can find a couple of species in the family Tetragonata we can find in the sort of first part of the cave. So as I said, they don't go into the deep zone, but they can go 20 to 30 meters into a cave, which, if any of you have been into caves, it is still very, very dark after about 5 to 10 meters in a cave. So for most practical purposes, vision and flight is not something that is useful. As I said, I just wanted to just broaden out a little bit and make sure we all understand what an orb web is and what the characteristics of an orb web is, because then it's going to be easier to explain the adaptations that I'm talking about later. So orb spiders are very common species, many in the UK, 52 in the UK as well. They're kind of starting to die out now that we almost, well, at least here in the south, we almost have had the first frost, which is when they typically start to disappear outside. But you will have seen up until now, probably in your gardens or in parks and stuff, these very large garden orb spiders that are basically everywhere. So there's actually quite a number of different families. The orb spiders are not in the same family, and there's two main ones that I'm mainly going to separate here. So the Aranidae is the ones that we are perhaps most familiar with. So that's the garden orb spider, and the ones we typically tend to see when we are out and about. And then there's the Tetragonatids, which our cave spiders belong to, which are slightly different in their webs, mainly by being more horizontal and having very minor differences in their actual structure. So the basic structure of an orb web is like that. And as I said, that goes for both types of orb webs. We have the hop and the freeze zone. So that's where the spider basically sits and presumably uses the freeze zone to sort of move from one side of the web to the other. Then we have the radii, or the spokes, sort of the wheel that goes from the center and then out towards the frame. And that's the sort of what the spiders use to detect vibrations in the web. So if a prey, a fly, gets trapped in the web, its vibrations will travel into the spider at the hop in the center of the web via these radii. The whole web is enclosed by the frame, which is it's not shown here, but this frame is then connected with a couple of anchor threads to the actual vegetation and surrounding things. So that's the standard orb web. And then, of course, we have the capture spiral, which, as I said, is the key one, right? That's where prey actually get caught in the web. And the traditional way, most of the spiders, the main two families we talked about so far, have silk droplets on their capture spiral, as you can see on the picture to the left. Which basically mean that anything flying into there is glued onto the web, at least long enough for the spider to capture them. Okay, but let's have a look at the three common sort of orb spiders we can find in caves. They're all in, as I said, all in the family Tetranychtidae. They're also all very closely related in a subgroup called the Metainae. And two of the species, which are the one we'll be talking about, well, actually, I'll mainly be talking about the one in the middle, which is the one I've studied most, Metaminardi, but Metaboneti is probably very similar as well. It's only found in the south of the UK, though, whereas Metaminardi is found throughout the UK. Metallina marianae, which I've also studied, is also found everywhere in the UK, but that's also a very common spider outside in sort of dark and damp habitats like dark forest or on the river overhang and stuff like that. And that one doesn't actually show any adaptations, at least not any obvious adaptations that we've been able to detect so far with the kind of behavioral studies we've done. But the Metaminardi does, so that is the one I'm going to focus on. We studied them in many different places in the UK. They are very common, as I said, if almost, not always, but most caves would probably have them, or at least in the vicinity, there would be some of them. They don't like caves that are too dry, so they do have require some humidity, but otherwise they're quite common in many caves. The main place we studied them, though, is in Creswell Crags, which is sort of in Derbyshire, and is sort of an archaeological park, so it's a very convenient place to study them because all of the caves are easy to get into. You can walk into them more or less. There's a museum on site, there's a restaurant on site, so it's very sort of relaxed field work. So what we basically do when we study the spiders is we try to get information from the spider web. I could have mentioned that with the spider web here, actually. One of the advantages with the spider web is that you can basically make measurements, right? You can take a photo of the web, or you can make actual measurement. You can count the number of radii, you can measure the distances between the spirals, you can measure the area and all this kind of stuff. So you can get quite a lot of information on these on the behavior, on the foraging behavior of these spiders, just simply by looking at the web and analyzing the web, which is, again, one of the reasons why cave spiders and spiders in general are very good model organisms for behavioral studies. But basically we do that, and then we also look at how do they respond to prey stimuli, and we use a tuning fork to sort of determining prey stimuli. I think I have a video of that in a short while. But okay, let's first sort of the first, which we did now a couple of years ago, and it's not us that just magically discovered it. Many other people had mentioned that, but nobody had really sort of studied it in a quantitative way with large comparisons. So this was the kind of first paper that did that. But basically what we can see when we compare to a closely related above ground spider, so that's a spider in the Metallina genus. So you remember I mentioned one spider, Metallina marianae, which is sort of a cave spider, but there's also many other spiders in that particular genus, and Metallina mengae is a very, very common spider outside in forests or in sort of meadow type habitats as well. And it has, as we can see, a completely normal type web, right? The ones we're familiar with so far. But then when we look at the web on the right, on the cave spider, we see that it's quite different. First of all, it's not quite as big. It doesn't have as much silk in it. It's a more simplified, fewer radii as well. But the main difference is probably, as you can see, that it has far fewer radii, far fewer frame threads, right? So you can see it's a couple of frame threads usually in these webs, but most of the radii are going directly out to connect to the surroundings in these kind of spiders, the surroundings here, of course, being the cave walls or the cave ceilings. So that's quite a difference, and it's not something we've seen in any other spiders really. So all spiders outside build this traditional web on the left with frame threads and then a few anchor threads that you can just about see in this particular picture one up, just right to the A, for example, that goes to the vegetation. So we were quite intrigued to try and understand, well, why do these cave spiders build webs that are so different from above ground spiders? Is it actually something to do with the environment in which they're found? Is it an adaptation, a behavioral adaptations to their surroundings? Before, of course, we could look into that, we need to first rule out completely whether there is any kind of other explanations. So there's a couple of potential explanations. One could be maybe, as I said, we compared with Metaline, compared a meta with a Metaline. They're very closely related sister genera, but they're not the same, right? So maybe some kind of evolutionary adaptation or something happened in the evolutionary past of the metaspiders so that they all constructed webs without frames, no matter where they are. That was quite tricky to detect because most of the spiders in the meta genus are found in caves, but we did manage to find one species that are not found in caves, Metastridulans, which instead can be found in Madeira, in sort of, it's not completely away from caves in that it builds on the cliff edges and sometimes at the very entrance or just in front of cave openings, as we can see on the picture here. Well, we went to Madeira a couple of times. A student of mine went the following year as well, and we measured quite a large number of these Metastridulans webs in different stages. And basically, as you can probably see from the photo there, all of these webs do have the standard frames and a few anchor threads that connect to the cliff edges. So at least that's an indication that it's not something that all metaspiders are doing, and then potentially not something that is in the evolutionary past, although we can't completely rule it out at this point because this species Metastridulans, we don't know anything about the phylogenetic relationship between species within the meta, so they could be, of course, that this is somehow one that has basically is a later one that has re-evolved frame threads by accident. Anyway, I mean, it would be quite unlikely, but we cannot completely rule that out. But safe to say that it's probably likely that it has something to do, that is something that has evolved because of the caves. Okay, well, maybe one thing is not so much an evolutionary response to the conditions, but more as part of their behavioral flexibility. So spiders in general are very flexible in how they construct their webs. They can build, they can modify their web depending on the conditions they are, depending on the prey they've caught, and all kind of different things. And some spiders have been shown to adapt their webs to very narrow conditions. And one of them is tetraneated as well. Here you perhaps difficult to see, but it's small little tubes, basically, much smaller than the spider would normally build its web in. And what happened when they get constrained to such small spaces is that they tend to construct webs with at least some frames, threads removed. So maybe it's within their behavioral plasticity, and it's just because they're very constrained in caves. As a couple of reasons, we don't believe that to be the case, though. First of all, even when they're very, very constrained, as in this case, spiders still construct more frames than we see. And also, they're not actually that constrained in the cave environments that we're looking at, right? We are looking at quite large spaces where the spiders can actually build quite large spaces. So we don't think that it is the explanation. Also, spiders don't seem, these particular metaspiders don't seem to show much behavioral plasticity as far as we can tell. We had a student of mine did a study on how they respond, how their web looks like and how their behavioral responses are at different distances into the web. And here I'm just showing a quick video with one of, just as I said, showing you how a tuning fork is being held to the web, and that tuning fork stimulate as a frequency that stimulate prey interactions, that you can see the spider respond to it as though it's basically a prey. So if we look at these kind of behavioral responses and couples those with the actual studies on the web, we don't really see much difference at the spiders, whether they're right at the entrance or whether they are deeper in. Again, we would expect that if it was more to do with behavioral adaptation, we have to do with behavioral flexibility, because the closer they are to the entrance of the cave, the more like outside conditions they would find. Interestingly, though, there is something happening with the very smallest of the juveniles. Potentially, it's a very small sample size, as you can see there, but it does look like maybe, and certainly something we have to look further into, whether something different happens in the smaller juveniles. Okay, there's also another fact we need to understand at this point in order to try and figure out what kind of adaptation, if it is an adaptation, and what one it might be. And that's their diet. So spiders outside, 100% of their diet is flying insects, right? They intercept things in their web and catch them and eat them. But interestingly enough, in the cave spiders, in the few sort of different studies that's been done on their diet, they have quite a large component of non-flying prey, right? So slugs and snails, myriapods, other spiders and beetles that don't tend to fly. So the question is basically, how do they manage to capture non-flying prey? And is that potentially related to the uniqueness of their web? Well, there's 3 hypotheses for how these spiders could capture non-flying prey. And the favored one, sort of to some extent up until now, at least if you look at the literature, is off-web active hunting hypothesis. So basically spiders leave their web and go looking for prey on the wall. And you will see a lot of papers saying that that's the case. When we looked into that, it's all anecdotal information. There's no evidence for this particular thing. The second hypothesis is the accidental prey slip hypothesis. So basically prey walks on the wall, fall into the webs and get caught by the spiders. And then the last bit is the radii trigger lines off-web hunting hypothesis, which is the one that links to the unique webs potentially being adaptations. But let me just very quickly talk a little bit more about these ones. So the off-web active hunting hypothesis, we haven't seen that in any other spiders, but again, well, not other orb spiders with webs at least. There are some tetrameted spiders actually that do not build webs, where the adults do not build webs at least, and they actually hunt on the ground. So it's not completely out of the question that this could be something similar happening in these spiders, although none of these Pachygnatha and tetrameted are not closely related to our meta spiders within the family of tetranatids. But there's not actually any real evidence for this. Meta spiders have never been seen carrying prey outside of their web. We do tend to mainly see spiders in their webs when they do that. And of course, if you think about it as well, why do they have their webs if they don't use them? If they're just going to leave them, why would they bother building them? If they do build them just to capture opportunistic flying prey, which we know they do, as I said, they do still capture flying prey, then by leaving those webs, they would lose an opportunity to potentially capture flying prey. So it seems unlikely, this particular hypothesis, but it cannot be ruled out at this stage. The accidental prey slip hypothesis, so humidity is very high in many of these caves. The walls are smooth, have thin water films, it's quite slippery. Spiders build fairly horizontally inclined webs, so it does make sense something crawls, falls into the web and would get eaten. And I think that probably is happening to some extent, but it's difficult to imagine that prey, in most cases, the kind of animals you find in caves would be ones that are adapted to live in caves, at least to some extent. So is it perhaps that likely that they will constantly lose their footing and fall into webs in large enough quantities to explain the large proportion of non-flying prey? I'm not convinced. So I'm more convinced about the third hypothesis, which is basically that the spiders use these radii as sort of trigger lines, similar to what primitive trap spiders do, right? So as I said, the radii attach directly into to the cave wall, basically, and as a prey would then be walking, they would walk into a radii, send signals up to the spider, and allow the spider to basically run out and capture the prey. There's also, though, quite limited evidence for this for this particular hypothesis, but there are a couple of, well, there's some laboratory studies that Peter Smithers did quite a while ago now that suggest that this is indeed happening, at least in a laboratory settings, where they basically seem to be doing something similar. But we've also recently made some observation in caves that potentially suggest that this could be happening. And I'm just going to show you some videos of this. So first of all, this is because it's not, we were in the caves looking, doing these other studies where we looked at webs and photographs, webs and doing other stuff. So we were not specifically filming for these particular behaviors, but happened to opportunistically see a couple of situations where we were quick enough to get camera on them. But the cameras is not particularly, the focus is not great, and the movement of the cameras are not great. But I'm just going to show you one of the videos. So it's attacked a centipede here. And as I said, it's quite tricky to see where things are. But if you look at the upper right arrow, the blue arrow is pointing at the actual spider. You can probably see the shadow on the back wall. This is sort of a spider shadow. So the actual spider is where the blue one is sitting in its web. The upper blue arrow, the second blue arrow, I guess, if you go from top to bottom, is where the radius, where we believe the radius attachment is, so where the prey is walking into the web. And then the last one is the centipede. You may or may not be able to see a little bit of long shimmering thing there. You will see a bit more now than when they move, hopefully. But keep an eye on the centipede down there. You can see then it touches something. The spider runs down, actually picks the wrong radar here, searches for it, tries to capture it, it runs away. But hopefully the main idea is that you get that they do respond to something crawling. So here's showing the tracks. Unfortunately, the software didn't really fit when the camera was moved, so the tracks are not completely correct, but they show the general movement of the spider in red and the centipede in blue. So centipedes are quite dangerous prey, which is potentially why the spider was not able to overcome or overpower the prey in this particular instance. We have a second example as well, which unfortunately is also unsuccessful and is also a dangerous prey. It's when we had as I said, we were doing some experiments in other meta spiders, and one of the spiders escaped because it got annoyed with all the lights and the stuff we put on, ran on the wall, and then ran into the web of another spider. But here's potentially a little bit more clear what's happening. Hopefully you can see a little bit more here, right? So you can see the spider quite clearly on the wall there. The blue arrow points to where we believe that the anchor thread would be. And then to the left, just under the timer, you can see another spider in the center of its web. So we see the spider just about touching around there somewhere, and the spider reacts, comes out, try to capture it. Well, actually, probably what happens is that it comes out, realize it's quite a large other spider, and then do not try to attack, right? So it actually escapes as well, the spider in red. It goes back into its web almost immediately. But this is the strongest evidence we have so far of this trigger line type of hypothesis. So it does suggest to me, again, obviously we need more evidence. We need to look at it in more detail, but it does potentially suggest to me that we are talking about at least that hypothesis being true, potentially with the prey slip. I think the prey slip hypothesis is also true to some extent. We have seen some prey fall, although not fall into a web, but we have seen some things, particularly, as I said, sometimes in the twilight zone, something from the outside is coming into caves and then maybe never not be so adapted to moving in slippery conditions. So I think that basically they get the food from 3 different sources. They get still flying prey. Obviously, something flies in by accident, or some of the cave midges and other things that are usually found in the caves will fly into the web. They get prey that is falling down into the web, and then they have this additional method of optimizing the kind of prey they can capture by removing the frames and then having the radar as trigger lines. So it'd be quite interesting to look at in sort of future directions as well. What does this actually mean for the biomechanics of the web, right? You don't have frames. How does that presumably make the webs less strong in terms of responding to windy conditions or forces of prey flying into the web? But we don't know at this point. So that would be quite interesting to look at potentially by modeling type of exercises. We also need to resolve the phylogenetic tree. So within the meta, there's quite a lot of different metas, currently 33 species, although unfortunately, this genus is a bit of a wastebasket. So any spiders that can't be placed in other genuses tend to be, in all genera, tend to be placed in there. So it's unclear whether, I'm actually fairly certain that not all of these 33 species are actually the meta, but for now they are. We only studied a very small proportion of them. We have our meta Menardi, showing the first, meta stridulans, as I showed as well. Meta boneti, quite common in Central and Southern Europe, which is very, very likely to have a modified web as well, but there's no actual quantitative studies of that yet. We have meta dolph from US caves, which I've been involved in studying, although we haven't published that yet, but they show modified webs similar to our meta Menardi, although more frames. So it seems like a little bit of a combination between that. And then we have meta japonica as well, which there are some indications also show modified webs. And then there's some other large meta spiders that I believe are definitely meta spiders, but that hasn't been studied. And then there's all the other species, as I said, which is unclear to what extent they are. So it would be interesting to look at all of that, get more data on their prey capture as well, potentially from the lab. The problem with the lab, of course, is that we're taking them out of their natural habitat and basically potentially changing their behavior. But there are now quite a few labs within caves, which hopefully would sort of be the best of both worlds. You can better control what's happening, but also you're still within fairly similar conditions to what they would be in normally. Okay, as I said, I promised very quickly to talk a little bit about other aspects of their ecology or behaviors that are quite interesting. And one of them that is quite surprising for a cave animal in general is that they do seem to be spending time outside of caves. So as far as we're aware, and there's quite some good evidence backing that up, so I think that is definitely true. They leave the caves in the sort of second to third instars, go outside, presumably build webs there, although we don't know what type of webs. We don't know if that's then normal webs with frames. That'll be very interesting to find out. But because they're so small and you can't typically identify spider species when they're juveniles, we have no reports of any of the spiders outside. I've been looking for them outside the caves we've been studying, but so far I haven't found anything I could reliably say would be one of them. But that would be interesting to know. But it's also quite interesting how, so they all leave the cave and then they go back into cave, which obviously they do because the adults are found in caves. How do they manage to find their way into caves? Their mating behavior as well, we don't know anything really about their mating behavior in this particular figure. Suggests that male might die. I'm not convinced because we see quite a lot of males around in caves waiting seemingly on females or just hanging about. So I'm not quite convinced that that's the case. They probably live much longer than spiders outside as well, but we don't know anything about that at the moment. Hatching and female dies after they laid their eggs. That's the potential. We certainly see them watching over the cocoon. You often see that they are guarding the cocoons for quite an extensive period of time. But again, it's not clear what's really happening. So quite a lot of unanswered questions. So do the juvenile stages have an outside stage? I think they do, but do they all go out? Maybe not. Maybe some stays back. How do they find their way back to the caves? Do they build normal webs? And if so, is that related to that kind of plasticity that there was some indication how cave spiders do show in caves as well with the small juveniles, presumably the one that's just returned from outside, if indeed they all go outside. And then do they show any kind of adaptations to reproductive behaviors? There's some quite interesting, it's just observation, but on the up top here, we have a normal male. That's the same as what you see in other orb spiders. The males have longer legs, smaller abdomen, generally smaller, and with longer legs. But then we also saw some quite strange looking males in Quest for Crack recently, that basically look like females, but you can tell, it's not so clear from this photo, but you can tell they're male if they have the sort of the boxing gloves, hands, which you might just be able to see the sort of the black round thing at the very front of them. So there might be some very interesting unanswered questions there as well. Okay, I managed to finish on time. So thank you very, very much for listening. And I should just thank, as I said, I've done this with some students and collaborators, and funding from the University of Oxford Nobel Fund and the British Cave Research Association.